Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
I'm very, very excited to introduce our guest today for the podcast. He works at Free Hearts, Free Minds with our mutual friend Yasmin Mohammed. He's an ex-Muslim who lived in his teens, is now a very, very outspoken critic of woke culture, which is a battle that is arguably the most important one fought socially and politically in our times. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Obaid Omer. Obaid, welcome to the show.
Hey, Bruce. Hey, Vincent. Thanks for having me on.
Right. How have you been doing during this pandemic? Crazy year we're having so far.
Well, okay, the pandemic, it didn't really bother me. Okay, I was living up in northern Quebec. Stupid thing happened, and I got frostbite on my toe. They couldn't deal with it up there, so they sent me here. So I've basically been sitting in Montreal for over a year doing nothing because of this. And so I was kind of like social distancing anyways, because all my friends work, and I got nothing to do during the week. Granted, I could go out and stuff, so it didn't really change my life all that much. So it's been all right.
Right, all the introverts are applauding you right now for that.
Well, yeah, like I said, so it's just whatever. Like I see my friends a little bit less than I did before, but that's about it.
Well, I think you work in IT, and I'm an engineer. I think that Vincent's really into physics, so you're dealing with three introverts and nerds here, so you're in good company.
But it's not even so much introverts. It's okay. I spent almost 13 years working in war zones. So I was isolated anyways. I'm kind of used to that. You're isolated, but you're in a crowd. Like it's like up north, I was in this little small town. You go to the restaurant. Like there was one restaurant attached to the hotel, and if you saw the cars in the parking lot, you knew who was there. But you could only leave by plane. So it's like you're completely isolated. And I did that. I was up north for 4 years, so I was kind of doing this for 17 years. So it's not even so much the introvert thing, because I'll talk to anyone.
Well, you've definitely been busy on your own podcast. I was listening to several of the conversations you've had with, the one with Benjamin Boyce really stood out to me, along with the one with Ione Italia, who is a lovely lady and a good friend of ours.
Ione is awesome.
She's great. But yeah, Obaid, I first heard of you through the Secular Jihadist podcast in a conversation between you and Armin Navali, and later through a mutual friend of ours, Killian Korth. All the controversy about Islam is how I came to find out that there was a real hypocrisy in the worldviews that's shared by most mainstream pseudo-liberals in the application of what we would call liberal values. But this conversation really has moved away since the time of since when Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses, and with what happened to Ayaan Hirsi Ali and the death threats. More people are involving themselves in a very nuanced criticism of Islam now, and so circumstances seem to have ameliorated themselves on that front to some degree. But I wanted to ask you about your feeling on this. Have things gotten better in terms of Islam? Is the discussion more open? I would say there is, but like not being on the front lines, I'm not one to say.
Yes and no. And I mean, the talk about the Islam thing with myself as well. I mentioned I was in war zones. I came back. And when I left, there's no social media. They didn't really allow social media on the bases because they don't want you to tag yourself. I'm in Kandahar. Like they don't want you to do that, right? So I didn't know what was going on. So I come back and I see all this insanity, and so my thinking was, okay, let's just more people speaking openly about it is better. So that's why I started doing it. But then I also was looking into why is Ayaan Hirsi Ali being called a white supremacist? Why are they calling Majid Nawaz an Uncle Tom and a house Muslim? And they're saying he's a racist house Muslim, not realizing like where the term house Muslim comes from. Like the origin of that, like it's house slave, right? And they don't use the term slave. and they're saying he's racist. So it was stuff like that was bothering me. So I spoke out about Islam because, okay, it's important. It needs to be talked about frankly and openly. And right now, I think there are more people doing it. And thankfully so. I mean, there's a lot of young ex-Muslims out there talking about it, but there's still that same pushback. It's Islamophobia. Now in the UK, I believe they said they didn't want to use the term Islamist anymore when describing terror attacks, which I mean, I have a problem with the term Islamist anyway. I just said Islamic terrorism, but whatever. So, like, in that aspect, it's getting worse. And I think the reason I started looking at why, people like Ayan and, Majid and Yasmin Mohammed and Mariam Namazi, Ali Rizvi, Sarah Haider, anyone, they would all get attacked, like the most disgusting attacks. And I was looking into that as well. And then I, took a couple of wrong steps and finally I fell into this finding out, started reading all this woke crap. And then that all started making sense. So yeah, there's more people speaking about it. It's more honest. But I think there's more pushback in the sense that, take the grooming gangs. The victims who are speaking out get called the most horrific things, like white whore, white slag, gammon, which now, whatever, I don't know exactly, but it's, apparently offensive, whatever. And when they complain, Twitter says there's no such thing as racism against white people, and so the conversation's still not being had properly.
Right.
At that sense, there's more people speaking out, and it's a little bit more free. The good things I see more coming from the Middle East, and I see coming from Africa. The Middle East, because of things like what Faisal al-Mutar is doing, Ideas Beyond Borders. And I believe Center for Inquiry as well, did one of Dawkins' books officially, and they started doing more, I think. But Faisal al-Mutar is translating books on science and logic and the Enlightenment. And during COVID, they were just doing all kinds of getting out good information on COVID instead of stuff that was coming from the state. And there's a real thirst for knowledge, and there's a real thirst for getting the information. Whereas if you look at in South Asia, it's the other way around. In the Middle East and even Africa, in Africa, it's more of a reclamation of their culture and getting away from, either Islam or Christianity, because both of, I think it's 45% Christian, 41 or 42% Muslim. So both those religions have. So there is this pushback. I don't see a pushback in, South Asia. I don't see a pushback in Asia Pacific really. I see the population as virulent as the state, if not worse. I'll give you an example. So a couple of years back in Pakistan, they made a stupid mistake, whatever. They made a clerical error, or so they say. They took out the line that all government officials have to swear that Muhammad's the last prophet, and the reason that's there is to keep Ahmadis out of politics. And because of that perceived lightening of scripture or Sharia, I think there was a couple 100,000 people protesting in Islamabad. And when they tried to send the military, and the military kind of sided with the crowd, and the government had to there wasn't anything really the government had done. So, but they perceived it as such. Whereas in the Middle East, they were protesting in Iran. They've been protesting in Iran for a couple of years. They were protesting in Lebanon. They've been protesting, in Saudi even. The women are just doing little things like turning the chador inside out. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the Middle East. There's stuff going on in North Africa where they're reclaiming their culture, the Amazigh, and the language is finally being recognized. In Africa, again, sub-Saharan Africa, how the hell is Somalia considered an Arab country, for fuck's sakes? Sorry, can I swear?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, I was rambling. So, I think it's the talk around Islam is, I have more optimism from the Middle East and Africa than I do even from the West, because of this woke crap. This woke crap is stopping you from actually talking about this. off Islam or whatever. Right, the Hong Kong protests at the end of last year, there were people who were actually saying things like, well, democracy is great and all, but that would be like colonizing Hong Kong all over again. So it'd be better if the CCP, oppressed them that way. Like they were serious about that.
Well, one of the when we talked to Yasmin, one of the things I shared with her was that when COVID hit, a friend of mine was told to check her white privilege because she's calling out the human abuses in China, and as and as an Asian individual myself, and having that really pissed me off. And I don't claim in any way to have experienced what ex-Muslims have to experience, but I got a small itty bitty taste of what you guys have to go through, and that was just infuriating to see this crap just contaminate the dialogue.
Okay, but that's
yeah.
Okay, I say that like when I came back, I was looking at what's going on with Islam. Like why can't I say forcing a woman to wear the hijab is a wrong thing? It's just the same way. Like I'm opposed to the law in Quebec where they say certain government workers can't have religious symbols, so they can't wear the hijab, they can't wear a crucifix, can't wear a Star of David, none of that. I'm opposed to that law. I'm opposed to the hijab as well. But why can't I say that it shouldn't be forced on women and then not be called a misogynist or I've been called a white supremacist. I mean, I don't think most white supremacists would find me white enough, but whatever. Like it's so. The talk around Islam and this woke stuff, it's the colonialism thing again. You can't push those ideas on them because it's colonialism. There's a paper in, I want to say 2001 or 2006. Those two dates stick out in my head, but it's called The Virtuous Cut. And it was talking about the benefits of FGM, so female genital mutilation. And it was a post-colonial thing. And basically imposing those white values on Africans, it was misogynistic, and it was racist, and it was colonialism again because it's our values putting on them. Then it got post-colonialism has where's all the relativism comes from. How dare we impose our values? How do I think I can fairly easily say that taking the knives to young girls' genitals is wrong. I think I'm safe there. I don't know what else to say on that point. So yeah, the stuff's been around for a while, and it's so when you can see it with Islam, when you can see it, like I said, with Ayan, you can see it with Majid. Now look at around the race issue. People like Glenn Lowry or John McWhorter or Thomas Chatterton Williams, Coleman Hughes, Chloe Valdery, someone I despise, Candace Owens. I think she's a horrible person for the discourse, but whatever. She doesn't deserve to be disrespected like this. They're called, again, Uncle Toms and, house slaves and race traitors. And in the UK, people like Trevor Phillips, and then there's Priti Patel. She's Indian. The guy running for mayor in London, Bailey, they call them coconuts and bounty bars, like the bounty chocolate. It's chocolate on the outside, this is disgusting. These are the anti-racists, right? And you don't vote for Biden, you ain't black. It's just essentialism. And it's the exact same stuff that's happening with race that was happening with Islam. There's right after the George Floyd things, and these people, like one of them had the guy done the study I think a year ago, and another one is working on it as part of his PhD. So they released their finding. Like the guy who done it a year ago, whatever, he'd already released it, but he released it again, and you can see from 2000 to 2000, like they did it till present day, so like whatever March, or they did it till that point, and they just and the guy from the year before was till last year. The terms race, racism, racist, white supremacy, when it was used, but the guy who did it last year also included Islam, and then it's kind of steady. It's not much. One of them was articles. The other one was the time those words were used. In almost every case around 2010, it started going up exponentially, and then by about 2012 it had doubled. By about 2016 it had tripled. Okay. There's something going on there. Like America, during the Obama era, America was becoming more racist. Like there's a problem there.
Mhm.
There's a narrative being pushed, and I don't like the term fake news. It's not fake. I think Michael Malice describes it best. It's factual, but it's not truthful. And I mean, just last year, there was an article in New York. Op-ed, granted editorial, so there's an opinion piece. There's 4 black girls. They're teenagers. I think they were between the ages of 15 and 17. There was 2 South Asian kids who were 16 and 17. The 2 South Asian boys beat up the 4 black girls, and I think one of them pissed on one of the girls or pissed on all 4 of them. The op-ed in the New York Times was, "This is due to whiteness," because the South Asian kids had internalized whiteness. Hey, I'm sorry, but if I'm your average Joe and I'm reading stuff like that, and I mean, there's others that came out. There was another one last year when all those attacks were happening in Hanukkah, and the last one, I think, which was the worst one, it was one of those black Hebrews or black Israelites. I can't remember whether they're really nutty, quite racist group. And it was a black guy, and again, one of the op-eds was, "Please do not let whiteness consume us." So you're having the same talk here around race, but it's gone up hyper because the amount of people speaking the language of critical race theory and intersectionality that are in media, that are in HR departments, that are in tech, has also gone up according to that. Like if you look at when intersectionality and all that stuff came out, so critical race theory, Derek Bell, 76, queer theory and gender theory and all that was in the 80s. And queer theory had its own weird version of intersectionality, like the way Kimberly Crenshaw is. It's how you are oppressed. With queer theory, it's how you are oppressing. It's almost the same thing. But anyways, in 91, when Crenshaw wrote Mapping the Margins, and by that point, Derek Bell started in 76 with critical race theory. By 91, when Kimberly Crenshaw wrote Mapping the Margins, she took the intersectional framework and she incorporated critical race theory into it. Now, sorry, I know this is getting off Islam, but I'll swear I'll get back to it. So that critical lens came in, and then so that started being taught, like the intersectional framework being used on critical race theory and being used specifically on queer theory and gender studies and now fat studies and disability studies. That framework being used, people being taught under that lens, and then getting out with masters and PhDs by the end of the 90s. So if you're in government and you want to, we have problems, we still have issues with race, which at the end of the 90s we know was a lot better. We were almost at that colorblind ethic. We were very close to it, I think. This stuff started coming into foreign policy. This stuff started going into lower management and interns in government, in the civil service, like not in not in political party, like not into people running or whatever. It started going into HRs, it started going into administrations and newspapers. It started getting into. It was already in universities. It started getting into more and more into high schools, and then middle schools. And like the last couple of years, it's a K through 12 everywhere. So as these people, by about 2010, if you got in as a lower management in 2000, by about 2010, you should have moved up to, if you've got any kind of competence. And you keep hiring more people that are being churned out thinking the same thing. And then everything is racist. Like, I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, racism is permanent and you have to look for it everywhere. So the big thing with Bush after 9/11, with Islam at that point, Bush was in place. So America's racist because of Islamophobia. And they spent 8 years churning out America's racist because of the Islam thing, and giving, misinformation on Islam and playing it down. And, the San Bernardino shooting, their neighbors were afraid to report some weird stuff they saw because they didn't want to be called racist. Again, in the UK, the grooming gangs, since the 80s, like, I've heard estimates of upwards of 500,000 girls from the mid-'80s till now that are being groomed and raped and sold into prostitution. Like, come on, because people didn't want to be racist. So, but like I said, after that intersectional framework came in, and then they started going into everything. We need someone to work on racism, so get a PhD in critical race theories. We need someone to work on feminism, so get a PhD in gender studies. something that, like, we need something to help with gay rights, so get a PhD in queer theory. But queer theory is where you have people saying that Pete Buttigieg isn't really gay. He's just a man who sleeps with other men because he doesn't embrace his queerness. Okay. You have Nicole Hannah-Jones, won a Pulitzer Prize for revisionist history, says that, there is such a thing as politically black, defending when Biden said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Like, and you can see the patterns with Islam, and you can see the patterns with the race.
Right.
So there were problems with Islam. They moved to race, but I think anytime someone tries to criticize Islam, you still get that pushback from the race thing. And you still see Zara. I mean, it's happened to her a couple of times where she reports rape threats from Muslim fundamentalists, and she's the one who gets banned for posting their rape threat that they already posted on Facebook. Right? Yeah. She gets a 30-day ban, but the original poster doesn't. So there is some weird thing going on here. Like, she's taken on whiteness because she's speaking out against the brown person. Like I said this, like I wrote this about 4 or 5 years ago, and I said, they can't see the victims for the brown people. That's all it is.
Right.
I ramble quite a bit, so feel free to stop me at any point.
Oh, absolutely not. When people ramble on, it is the best, because that's the best opportunity that we have at really understanding your viewpoints, and that's what we love. And you brought up so many great things that we can open a discussion on, right? So the whole topic of wokeness. What I try to do, and I try to make this case, I was on Dave Worley's podcast yesterday, I try to make the case that the best way to tackle wokeness is to tackle it at its roots. And you talked about it, right? What's happening in the academy with critical race studies, queer studies, fat studies, disability studies, all these academic disciplines that really came from the Frankfurt School and from French philosophers around the 1960s. That's what it effectively turned into. And so I think because it's so difficult to really categorize wokeness, what exactly is it that we're criticizing when we talk about wokeness, right? It's not just microaggressions. It's not just people wanting safe spaces. There has to be some framework that we can tackle on specifically that makes it much more clear what it is that we're talking about. And I would love to give you your chance to define wokeness, because a good friend of mine, Arvin Avabi, was on the podcast with Shannon Q, and they were arguing about wokeness and what it was. And I noticed that you replied that you disagree with both of their definitions on wokeness. So what would you say is the best way to define it? How it's the best way to tackle it?
Okay, so a couple of different things on woke, right? So the term woke comes out of black feminism and the black power movement, so late 60s, early 70s. So, and it was this thing called, I think now they call, when they had the intersectional framework, they call it the critical consciousness, but it was, back then it was the black feminism was working on a materialistic view. So it was, capitalism is the white man's tool to keep us down. Capitalism was white. So it was, that's why Nation Islam has some communist trends to it. Black Panthers, there's a lot of socialism involved in some of that stuff as well. So, then I think it was 78, Audre Lorde's paper, The Master's Tools Will Not Tear Down the Master's House. So woke came from that. And I don't, it kind of died out with that stuff, because I'm not saying that black feminism was still there, because you still had Angela Davis, you had this stuff going on, people were still writing this, that you still had that, but that kind of idea, it wasn't, there wasn't a meme factory like Twitter, right? You didn't have that. So it didn't really take off. And then it came back around, so they're still in the literature and stuff, but it wasn't used. But it's like 2006 or 7. What's her name? Erica Baidu or whatever her name is. She had it in a song, and that picked up a little bit. But and they were like, "Oh, I'm waking up to oppression, this and that," but it's not going back to that. Then I think it was when Black Lives Matter came around at Trayvon Martin that they reclaimed it to what the original version was. Now, if you look at the critical race theorist intersectionality or whatever, again, it was in the literature, they would have used it around themselves, but they were talking about a critical consciousness. So their critical consciousness is I know you guys have spoken with James Lindsay, so he can explain it. I mean, he knows orders of magnitude about this more than I do. But anyways, the critical consciousness was you look at everything critically, and not in like the sense of critical thinking, but you problematize everything. In queer theory, they would you queer everything. Everything's got to be queered, so that's where it turned into a verb. So it's because once something becomes normal, it's normalized, then it's part of the hegemony, the systemic racism, whatever. So that it's bad. That's why gay men are now they're just plain old white men, because you got everything, you got your rights, you're no longer oppressed. It's so that consciousness is what they were imbuing into woke in like the 90s and stuff like that, and that's still what they mean. So someone like Shannon, okay, I don't really know her, I don't, from what she said there, she's wrong, but it's, if you just think it's defending trans rights and human rights, no, it's not, because I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw even said in Mapping the Margins that the liberal ethic that took social significance away from race was bad, and that you have to build an identity for marginalized people, and you have to make your politics all around identity. So it has nothing to do with Martin Luther King's ethic. It's opposed to that. It hates the Enlightenment, and it hates equal treatment, because stupid example. I shouldn't say stupid, but Barry Weiss, Thomas Chatterton Williams, and they were on Bill Maher. So the three of them were talking, and some blue check mark on Twitter, whatever, critical race theorist, blah, 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 blah. Can you imagine this? Barry Weiss and Bill Maher and Thomas Chatterton Williams talking about race, and there's not even one person of color. Like, Thomas Chatterton Williams is half black, like his mother's white, his father's black.
I saw that on Twitter. Yeah, that's crazy.
That's the kind of shit you're dealing with. Like, Kanye puts on a MAGA hat. Kanye ain't black. Like, I'm sorry, but go fuck yourself. Like, again, it's insulting to me too. Like, there was some meeting in Toronto, end of June, something like that. I don't know, days blur. And there was brown complicity and white supremacy, and because we let white people give us jobs so that they can say they're not racist, and they give us jobs because it helps them deny their racism, and we're helping them, so we're complicit in their. So it's brown complicity and white supremacy. Like, what? So there's no way I could have gotten the job because I earned it on my own merits? Like, that's the same thing racists would say. He only got the job because he's brown. He's an affirmative action hire, right? And they're saying the exact same thing, but this is the inclusive side. So this stuff is really screwed up all the conversation. And again, I go back to the late 90s. I'm not saying things were perfect, and this stuff was around a little bit, but not to the extent it was. And that's when it really, I think, started affecting policy and stuff. Mm-hmm. Things had gotten good. Like, I'm not saying they were perfect. I don't think it'll ever be perfect. You're never going to get rid of assholes. There'll always be bigoted assholes. But I think it was getting to the point where, how Sam Harris said that the color of your skin should matter about as much as the color of your hair. And I think it was getting closer to that ethic. And like the end of the 90s, you had, and the people are going to say, oh, look at the wealth gap. And I know the wealth gap's there, and there's it's part of the problem with focusing everything on race. But there were black families who were opposing the estate tax because they were like one of the first generation of black millionaires that were able to leave enough inheritance that would affect their heirs. So they were concerned about that. That's a good thing. Yes, there's still not enough. If you want to take a look at, there's black people make up 23%, and blah blah blah. It's not proportionate millionaires. Like, I'll grant you all that, but it had started to a point when we were actually focusing on the actual issues and not imbuing everything with race or sexism or homophobia or whatever you want to say, like not imbuing it with something. It was just not taking a very complex issue and bringing it down to a univariant solution. So when you started focusing just on race, like, the racial laws were gone. The attitudes had changed. We were willing to, but then you had these race theorists come out. Oh, you got a PhD in race theory. Great. You're going to help us solve racism. Because you want someone to work at CERN. Oh, we want a physicist with a PhD in physics. You're not going to go get a PhD in art history, right? To go work at CERN. Like it's the same thing with race. It makes sense. It comes out of the academy. It's the idea, like what Brett Weinstein said, idea laundering. Like they've been granted, they've got their credentials. You trust the PhD. You trust the academy. You trust that the system worked, and the system didn't.
The problem though is like and literally and those BS and BS, because they've shown through those faux grievance studies papers that those degrees, that area of study.
You cut right up, man.
Yeah, it burst you off, cut out.
Yeah, but these people who have these degrees, they pretty much have a BS in BS, because James, Peter, and Helen have shown that these fields are corrupted, but through their faux grievance studies papers. They're nonsense. Yeah.
They tried. Peter got brought up on an IRB review there. They were basically said, oh no, this is blah blah blah. This didn't prove anything. Now people are looking at it and taking it seriously, but you still have people that said shut down STEM. You still have people who are respectable scientists who I don't want to denigrate their work, but they're going along with this stuff,
right?
Decolonized science and all that. I mean, it's like, oh, we should give papers credence on the color of the skin of the author. Like, no. Give everyone a fair shake. But printing a paper in a physics journal about light supremacy and how light supremacy in physics is like white supremacy, what in God's name does that have to do with physics? It's 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 anymore. Come on.
Yeah. This is the scary thing, where originally we could at least be comfortable in the idea that this was just isolated to the humanities, but now it's pestilentially spreading into STEM. And many prominent physicists aren't talking about it. Like Sean Carroll isn't talking about it. Instead of recognizing what happened with the grievance studies hoax and at least give credence to the idea that maybe these academic disciplines are nowhere near as scholar-worthy as they claim to be, he criticized James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose because what they did was mean. Like, that's what you're focusing on? That's like finding a murderer and just criticizing the people who found the murderer because the reason they found him was because they looked through his private diary. Like, that's just the worst thing, the worst way to analyze the situation.
Yeah, but okay, it's the harm thing. You're doing harm, right? And it's coming into it's already in medicine. Like, you got equity medicine, and it's like the first thing is do no harm. If you change what the definition of harm is, then that's going to cause a lot of problems. But okay, there's so many things going on here. It's not just this study. Like, it's not just I think this has a huge part of it. Like, don't get me wrong, but if you look at what Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff did in Coddling the American Mind, so. I think it's with things like helicopter parenting, with the validation, with the self-esteem movement, with all that created. So those people get out of high school in the late 80s. They started around 85. They get out of high school in the late 80s. They go into college. Some of them go into then they go into all these fields like the gender studies and blah blah blah, critical race theory, and they're brainwashed. Like, there's a lot of, other than social media comes around, everything's spread a lot faster, and so it was just a big perfect storm of all this stuff at the same time. But yeah, the woke culture is just, it's not that it's gotten, it's attacking the STEM fields, not so much from getting into the journals, and it's starting in math, and it's going to start in these other fields as well. They're talking about queer engineering and all that, but it's coming from it's not English majors and history majors or even critical race majors going up to physics and saying you're doing physics wrong. It's the critical race theorists and the intersectionalists who got into the diversity officers who are coming to the administration that's coming to the physics department saying you're not diverse enough. You're not publishing enough from physicists of color. I don't know. Like, that's where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So again, John McWhorter, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think he said in like the space of a weekend, he got something like 160 emails, and they kept coming and coming, or the weekend, or one night or something like that, of people in universities who are afraid to speak out. And it's, and then you'll get defenders, not even defenders, but people who think like, oh, well, woke is not all that bad, whatever. But look at what they're doing in the right-wing universities. Those right-wing Christian universities have been doing that forever. They're assholes. There's no defense of them. There used to be the ACLU. There used to be people who would defend you. Now the people who are defending you are the ones who are attacking free speech. The ACLU doesn't care about it anymore. Mm-hmm. Universities are giving it up. So, like, the left is giving it up. And so when there is no counter to what was on the right, which was always, again, that was so small. It was minuscule. Even people on the right were just like, shut up, like, leave us alone. But you bring this stuff into school. You've already got kids who are being validated this and that. And I think I heard Coleman Hughes talking about this. He started seeing intersectionality in high school in 2012. As far as I can tell, it came into like certain curriculums in certain states around 2010. In Canada, was in British Columbia in middle schools in 2013. And these are public schools, and it's not in private schools. It's not in charters. Okay, it's not in, some private schools might have it, some charter schools might have it, but it's in public schools as part of the public curriculum. And so you're telling kids who's oppressing who. You're telling kids that these people have kept you down. You're always being oppressed. You're being oppressed by them. You'll never succeed. How do you expect these people to succeed if that's what they're being taught in school? Now they're being, like in Seattle, like math through an ethnic lens. Like, what the fuck is that? 2 + 2 is 4. Until you get to higher order mathematics, and no one needs those higher order mathematics unless you're a mathematician. It doesn't. You need trigonometry even if you want to be a carpenter. You can work out the angles and stuff like that, but you don't need, the higher order mathematics. You don't need how to like calculate in base 3 to know that 2 + 2 = 11, because that's how you write 4 in base 3. It's a total deconstruction of everything.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you brought up a good point right there at the beginning when you brought up the work of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in The Coddling of the American Mind, where it's not just the historical aspect that we have to analyze the situation through. There's also a psychological aspect that we have to look through. What happens after the disappearance of Eton Potts, and what was the whole change in parenting back then. And, it's funny that you mentioned that, like, John McWhorter got so many emails, gets 160 emails frequently from academic, tenured professors who say, that they're tired of this stuff, but they don't want to speak up about it. I can safely say almost every professor that I've had a conversation with about what's going on in the academy all say the same thing, that this stuff is ridiculous. A lot of them go so far as to say, deconstructivism was always in the humanities, but we just sort of made fun of it. But, and unfortunately, we kind of screwed up there because we should have been criticizing it before it started now coming into STEM. And that, as you've mentioned, now it's all over STEM. In what universe do we have to have a conversation about whether or not 2 + 2 = 5? This is some 12th century pre-parochial stuff. This isn't something that anybody in the 21st century should be concerned about. And I want to ask you about another analysis that people have that I am not too fond of, because I think it oversimplifies what's going on. A lot of people like Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan even has said it, Jordan Peterson has said it, that a lot of the reason why so many people are becoming increasingly woke is because religious narratives are dying, people need narratives, and so they jump from one narrative to another. What are your thoughts on the drop in religiousness, right? The United States is now the only first world country that is predominantly religious, and the increasing in people adopting these critical methods.
Okay, I'll get that. I just wanted one quick thing about the 2 + 2 = 5.
Mm-hmm.
Just because they're not saying 2 plus 2 equals 5. And this is the deconstruction thing, and this is how they work. This is how it works with everything. I'll just take a couple minutes on this.
Right, no worries.
They're saying there's 2 plus 2 equals 5 under certain conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And it does. Right? Like I said, I don't understand the higher order mathematics. I will not even try to explain it. I can explain the 2 plus 2 equals 11 and base 3 because I get that. But 2 plus 2 can equal whatever you want because there are multiple different frameworks. There's multiple different dialogues and discourses, and it's standpoint epistemology. It's like how you look at things. And so the way you look at 2 plus 2, 2 plus 2 could equal unicorn. It doesn't matter. So it's not that 2 plus 2 equals 5. It's 2 plus 2 equals whatever you want. Right. They deconstruct everything down. Sorry, I said that. Yeah. You got to understand. Like people got to understand. Like it's not just as simple as what they're saying. There's a whole other insanity behind it.
Right. That's Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism. His whole thing about language and how it's used to deconstruct. And
and
how words are relative. Yeah.
Colin Wright had a great tweet about this. He says 2 plus 2 can equal 5 if you redefine what plus means. The statement is about as insightful as pigs can fly if you redefine pigs to mean birds. It means nothing.
Okay, so the religion thing. All right, I'm going to base this from the Abrahamic faith. All right, so the serpent comes into the garden, tricks Eve into eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge; it's the knowledge of good and evil. Okay. Now, God, creates Adam. Adam's lonely, pulls out a rib, creates Eve. Here you go. It's like I created all of this for you. This was done by me. Worship me because of this. I give you the rules because I created all this. Now, I'm not calling this science, but science is the quest for how did we get here? How did this all get created? Whatever. God gave you the answers. So from the Abrahamic perspective, that is the science taken care of, right? I'm not calling it science, but whatever. That is the science taken care of. That knowledge is given to you. That knowledge is God did this. The knowledge that was denied them was the knowledge of good and evil. So that is the humanities. That is the arts. That is stories. Now, I'm not saying that James Lindsay's book, Everyone's Wrong About God, I think he gets this pretty right. He says something similar to that. Like, it's not that we used to have a lot of shared narratives, right? So go back to even like the late 90s. Before you could, you had a million channels coming into your house, plus you could stream whatever you want. You had there's so many little niche markets that, I mean, Jesus Christ, you got a show about people going crabbing. Like, come on. There's so many little niche markets. There is no show like Seinfeld anymore, where, like the water cooler shows, where you'd stand around the next morning, except for you had Game of Thrones come out, and that was a shared myth that we all had because it was watched by so many people, right? Or the Avengers movies, or the Marvel movies and things like that. They're like these big events that happen that we have these shared myths. I mean, religion was basically that, but it codified laws into the shared myths, right? So and so I'm not. I think Rubin's wrong. I think Rubin's wrong about a lot. Whatever. That's Peterson. I respect him on his free speech stance, but once he starts talking about God, my eyes roll over because he doesn't say anything worthwhile. He's too wishy-washy. He doesn't take a stand. I mean, he so yeah. I don't think it's not so much when everything is deconstructed, and this stuff is in the air, so it's not just like if you study it, you're going to be brainwashed to it. Some of it is in the air that everything has to be taken apart. There's a lot of postmodern art, and there's a lot of like postmodern style movies and everything. Like everything is break it down. Like that deconstructed cooking. Like you could go in basically like inhale the air from like chocolate mousse or something stupid like that. Like it's some of it's cool, but whatever. Like it's so some of this is in the air, so everything's being taken down, breaking apart. And then this stuff is also, and then again, this stuff is being pushed through a lot of things, like, Western civilization is evil. We've been hearing that since 2000, since 9/11. Since 2001. Like, we've been hearing that since 9/11. Like, that's like, we don't have a shared myth anymore. So this wokeness or whatever, I mean, it's not just wokeness. I think wokeness, you're having a generation of kids. Like I said, Coleman Hughes, 2012. So you had 8 years. You have two high school grades that have graduated learning this crap. Okay, this stuff is divisive. If you look back to the late 80s and the early 90s, when you had a lot of the gang, like the Crips and the Bloods, and then you also had a lot of skinheads in the southern states. Excuse me. The people who are doing the deprogramming, or if you listen to what Majid Nawaz says, like about de-radicalization, the gang members or ISIS or Hizb ut-Tahrir or the Taliban or whatever, they look for the disenfranchised. They look for the loners. They look for the kids who feel set upon. Teaching this stuff to kids, that's what it's doing. If you're black, okay, well, all these people shit on you. If you're brown and Asian, well, you got shit on a little bit by these people, but you also shit on them. If you're white, you shit on everyone. Like, it's creating divisions. It's creating neurotic, fucked up kids. Like, why do you think you had a bunch of kids from the U.S., like white kids, go join ISIS? Why were there more Muslims in the UK that joined ISIS than joined the UK military? Because you had them being taught crap like this. They go to the mosque. They hear that Westerners are, like Saudi's been funding mosques in the West for a long time. So if you're at a fundamentalist mosque, you're going to hear this stuff. You're going to hear this stuff in school. You're going to feel set upon. Like Majid talks about how he joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, right? So this stuff is going to create these people who will go join. If they're white, it's a correlation on my part, but I'm sure you can actually do a study of when this stuff started going into high schools and the rise of white supremacist groups, because I'm telling you, it's a direct response to that. But I'm not saying there's no white supremacist groups, but there was such a small little thing. Why are white people aren't becoming racist? They're being made racist. And there's also, like, in Black Lives Matter, there's like the melanin theory that you've still got, like, in Nation of Islam. You had Nick Cannon with that the other day. No people talked about his anti-Semitism. No one talked about him, like, with the melanin theory and all that, like, being racist towards white people, because you can't, apparently. So it's not so much that the religion, but it is a shared sense of stories. It's a shared sense of belonging. It's a shared narrative. And the narrative that you could have had, which would have been the best one, was the narrative in the Enlightenment, which, I mean, say whatever you want about the U.S. and say about whatever you want about the Founding Fathers, but the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, those documents were written on the values of the Enlightenment. They're like the values and the ethics in there. If you follow that, and it was being fulfilled, they were following that ethic, and it was being fulfilled, and it was going, and it was getting faster and faster and faster. And so you could share that common spirit. So religion did provide stuff. It provided you community, it provided you a sense of belonging. Like, you go to church on Sunday, and it could be like the richest person in town with the poorest person in town sitting next to each other, praying to the same God. Whatever. I have no problem shitting on religion. I mean, there is no truth to it, but it gave you that sense of belonging and community. And if you don't have that, and you're being taught that everything about your civilization, your culture, is absolute shit, or that you've lost all your culture because of these other people, and you've got nothing, and there's no hope, I don't think you're going to have a healthy society, and I don't think you're going to have people that are able to deal with it well, and they're going to try to grab anything that, why do they go join ISIS? Because it gives them a sense of belonging and community, and maybe, I'm going to be a hero or something. Join the Black Panthers, join the Nation of Islam, join BLM, whatever. You're joining a community. You're getting that sense of belonging, and it's done through there. And so there is something a little bit there, but I think Rubin is way too simplistic when he talks about it. I haven't heard Rogan really say anything about it, or if he has, he talks so much that I forget. He says a lot. And like I said, Peterson, he's too wishy-washy when he talks about religion. He won't commit. So like I'm not going to trust his judgment.
Obaid, I want to follow up with you on that point about about the shared narrative that we follow. Are you familiar with Shelby Steele's work at all?
Nope, don't even know who that is.
Okay, so he's a black conservative who wrote a book that really influenced John McWhorter, and I was curious about that. So just recently, I started looking into his material, and he wrote a book called Shame, and he made a very, very persuasive argument about the 1960s. And we know that during the 1960s is when postmodernism really started coming into play, but there was also something else going on at the time. About a week or so ago, I listened to your rant about the woke ideology, and I was just laughing along, shaking my head, because it was really giving voice to what all of us, all three of us being genuine liberals, are thinking. And anyway, like I read his book Shame, and like he makes the argument that what the culture, the shared acceptable morally, what's considered a morally acceptable framework that we all have to take part in today is rooted in white guilt, and that guilt is based off the idea that these Enlightenment principles, like including the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a completely hypocritical idea. It wasn't extended to people of color when the United States was created, or to women, and in the West, there's a culture of imperialism. And in the 1960s, with the women's rights movements, with Vietnam, with the Civil Rights Act, that hypocrisy, according to him, was just laid bare. So he makes the claim that it was during that time that if you wanted to be able to cast off that kind of guilt, you had to buy into a culture predicated almost exclusively on shame and self-flagellation. But the problem is that, if you acknowledge any progress in human rights in our culture today, it becomes really easy for someone to shoot you down if you say that, hey, we made progress, we're reducing racism, we're pushing the envelope in terms of Enlightenment values and recognizing people and their sovereignty despite their immutable characteristics. But shame just gives the regressive left this social capital it has to really push the narrative, this postmodernist deconstructivist narrative across. And it's a really, really easy cudgel for them to fall back on when they want to say, hey, there's another way of knowing here. Or this practice of misogyny or homophobia is acceptable even if it's counter to the values in our own culture. But this idea of shame taken to this extent is just disingenuous. Like, have you discussed this aspect with people? What have your conversations been like in that regard?
No, not really. I mean, the shame thing. Robin DiAngelo says this in White Fragility. I'm going to get the quote wrong, but basically she says the civil rights movement was bad because it made being racist a bad thing, so people could say, I'm not racist, so therefore I'm good. Okay, it didn't solve the problems of racism. It just made being racist bad. So then people stopped being racist, but the problem of racism was still there because racism is permanent. Now, I don't know. I'd have to read Shelby Steele's book. But what you're talking about sounds to me a little bit like this guy, Frantz Fanon. He was a psychologist or sociologist from France, and he went to Algeria, and he wrote the book I've read is called The Wretched of the Earth. It's a fucking horrific book. And it's a nasty, nasty piece of work. But he was writing about the FLN, the Algerian liberation movement against France, right? And he said that, I mean, basically it comes down to those that were oppressed need to oppress their oppressor for the same amount of time before they can achieve equality or a sense of worth or freedom, because if you were oppressed for 500 years, then your people have to oppress your oppressors for 500 years, and you're on equal footing. Wow, Hammurabi's code, like an eye for an eye, pretty much, like, but taken to a hyper extreme. So that's what that shame thing sounds like. No, I don't think it came out. Okay, if it did come out of some shame, like let's say, okay, how could we be treating people like this? Yeah, what was going on, end of slavery, Jim Crow comes in, all the way down up until 65, Civil Rights Act, 68, Voting Act. Then you get women's rights coming in the 70s, and more and more gay rights coming through until finally in the States a couple of years ago you had the gay marriage was legalized. But to say that all that came out of shame, I think white people in some extent have, and this is not a collective guilt or whatever, but if you're living in the North and you didn't really know what was going on in the South, I think you can, again, there was no memes. There was only what you read in the newspapers. TV was just starting to become more ubiquitous in the early 60s, right? It's so you didn't see it. You didn't know about it. It was easier to be ignorant. But once people started seeing it, they were like, this is wrong. So, I mean, the ethic was there. Okay, 1776, the U.S. is formed. 1865, slavery, like Civil War ends, and then I think it was like the Emancipation Proclamation. I think it was 3 years later, it was an act of Congress. Like I said, then Jim Crow laws start. Jim Crow laws are gone by 1968. So like another 95 to 100 years there. But that's for all of them to be gone. From the time they started till 1968, certain laws were being taken away, like Brown versus the Board of Education was like 54, right? So these laws started being taken away. By 1968, all the laws were gone. You still had to change attitudes and stuff. By the late 90s, from 68 to 98, in 30 years, I'm going to say, it's whatever. I'm going to focus too much on that, but black families were concerned about passing on their millions. They didn't want their heirs to be taxed. We were getting to that colorblind ethic. Being racist was a bad thing, but we weren't calling people racist for dumb things. We weren't like there was systemic oppression. There was systemic oppression by wealth and by class, and even then, I think there were still some issues. Like even back in the early '90s, and there's problems with Rodney King, like all kinds of issues there. But we don't want to be racist, so let's open up immigration. Great thing. My family immigrated to Canada in the 70s. I'm not taking anything away from immigration. But there's still problems in black communities. There's still problems in those communities, and it's affecting black families more than anyone else. Why, people say, well, look, immigrants come in, they can do better. Well, immigrants get a little bit of a leg up from the government when they come in. They get some small bit of a leg up. And so then that little bit of a leg up might help. So I'm not talking about reparations. I'm not talking about anything like that. But so instead of, let's say, you're taking in 1 million people a year, you're taking 500,000. The money you would spend on those 500,000, if you spent on, marginalized neighborhoods, like poorer neighborhoods, and started helping building up that infrastructure. Like, I'm not saying that would have been the perfect solution, but just, little things like that. Like if you actually, instead of just stopped looking for racism, but actually looked at overall holistically what the problem was, you're being racist if you don't help those neighborhoods, but you're also being racist if you allow in too many immigrants. And this is not a thing to say don't allow in immigrants. I'm just saying, like, maybe there's something there. You can argue don't spend as much money on the military. I used to be a military contractor, but I can agree with you. I saw a lot of waste of money. But when someone wants to have that kind of conversation, just to instantly call them a racist and all these kind of, like, and a bigot, and you're a horrible person, blah, 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 you're anti-immigration. It's like, no, there's valid conversations that has to be had around all this stuff. So let's focus on what is wrong, why there's poverty, why those things are happening. And I'm not saying that race has nothing to do with it, because anyone who says that is an idiot. Race has played some part, but I think it's one of the smallest factors in there.
Yeah.
I mean, the drug problem, like treat drug drug problem like an addiction, not a crime. But again, that you can't say, oh, that's racist policies. It was black mayors and black neighborhoods asking for more police, asking for the gang members to be taken out. And then you end up having a generation without fathers or a couple of generations without, like, there was all kinds of screw ups. And a lot of it was, I think, because they were like, oh, we'll have to deal with the racism. And it wasn't really racism, it was something else. And they were not looking for the something else. They were just looking for the racism. Or looking for the sexism, or looking for whatever. It's not did racism take place, it's how did racism manifest. Instead of saying what happened, you're already going in saying it's racism. You're going to find it. So like sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you came close enough, yeah.
No, it's good. So we're coming up on the hour, so I think this is a good place to end it. Obaid, it's been an absolute honor to have you on. Well, where can people find you? Your Twitter or Facebook? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, sure. Facebook and Twitter, same thing. On Twitter, it's at Obaid Omer. Facebook, it's just my name. I don't do much on Facebook. I just kind of post my podcast. Do a little podcast. You can find it on SoundCloud under Dangerous Speech, or if you go on YouTube, it's under my name. It's also on Apple Podcasts, and I think it's on Google. I can't remember now. I'm bad at self-promotion, so.
You and me both. Yeah, but once more, it's been an honor to have you on. I would say that you are incredibly brilliant and articulate, but as I've learned, it is racist to call the POC articulate, so I will not do that. But thanks for coming on. It's been an honor.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Bruce. It was fun to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Obaid.
All right. Yeah.